Happy Friday. Here's what we're buzzing about at NewsBeast. Occupy Wall Street yesterday. Big day, largely peaceful protest that ended with a march across the Brooklyn Bridge. Does this signify a new start to the movement or its end for winter hibernation? But first, the cheat picks. Ramin, you're on Regis. What you got?
You know, actually, I'm cheating on my cheat pick a little because it's not on the cheat sheet. But this is such a big story. Katie Couric did a huge special on it last night. It was even on Taxi TV this morning. Regis Philbin, after 28 years on TV, after 17,000 hours, signed off this morning. And I was watching, and it was very sad. He had all his friends in the audience. Diane Sawyer was sitting in the very front. And it was, his wife was there, and it was like this momentous, it really felt like this momentous moment. After Oprah left that show, Regis and Kelly has 5 million viewers. And a lot of, I know, Michelle, you're not a huge fan, but a lot of people in middle America really, really like Regis and grew up with Regis, and they think of him as a father figure.
Yeah, it's not that I'm not a huge fan, I just find him profoundly uninteresting. And although my cheat pick maybe can't raise to the level of significance that would get it on Taxi TV, mine would be Newt Gingrich and his kind of, and the latest revelations of his hypocrisy and kind of cronyism. You know, Newt Gingrich, to me, is such a fascinating figure because he's just the apotheosis of the modern Republican Party's venality. And so, you know, first we see that he was taking money from Fannie and Freddie, ostensibly to provide his $1,000 an hour historical services. Now we see that he's also been involved in pushing the very healthcare reform that he's been decrying so vehemently on the campaign trail.
Does this ultimately, you think, this mean that his 15 minutes are shorter than the other folks who've come before him as the conservative alternative to Mitt Romney?
Well, I don't know, because, you know, they're running out of anti-Romneys, and so he very well just might be the last one standing.
I think he's going to ride out for a little bit longer.
I'm impressed that now it's not just Fannie and Freddie hypocrisy, it's healthcare. But speaking of hypocrisy and otherwise lost opportunities rooted in Washington dysfunction, the super committee is my cheat pick, because this is the biggest story going on in America over the next 72 hours. We have this fundamental problem with our deficit and debt. It is largely a political crisis, even more than a fiscal crisis. The super committee, bipartisan, was put together to deal with the problem because Congress essentially punted. They couldn't do it on their own. Here, after 2 months of meetings, and 150 congressmen saying go big, hit $4 trillion to really put a dent in the long-term deficit and debt, it looks like they're going to, if anything, fall across the finish line. If we're lucky, get 1.2. And this is just pathetic. This is just the latest sign of the divided, dysfunctional Congress, and it is a lost opportunity. I still am holding out some hope that they can pull it out because they still have, you know, around 3-4 days to refocus and think big. But all that positional bargaining leads to a predictable result.
I just want to say quickly, I think that less than a divided, dysfunctional Congress, this is a crisis of a dysfunctional Republican Party. I mean, you basically have one side willing to negotiate, put entitlement reform on the table, and one side that is kind of increasingly fundamentalist and immovable in its position.
I think the leadership of the Republican Party is more recalcitrant than the leadership of the Democratic Party. The far left in the Democratic Party, there are around 70, 80 votes that say very loudly that they won't accept any entitlement reform. But I think that's not indicative of the kind of coalition in the center you could create.
Do you think there's any chance this could actually get resolved?
No.
No. Well, yes, there is. Yes, there's a chance because there's time. And when there's time, there's hope. Let's talk about Occupy Wall Street. Big day yesterday, Michelle. You were there from early morning hours at Wall Street to Foley Square and the march across the bridge. Tell us what you saw.
Well, I think that what we saw was, you know, these protesters really trying to make Bloomberg and the city wish it had left them alone in Zuccotti Park, where they were kind of dwindling and becoming increasingly irrelevant. Kicked out of the park, they set out to actually occupy Wall Street. You know, thousands of people linking arms in the corners, blocking access to buildings, really kind of disrupting things in a way that made them very hard to ignore. You know, I think that again and again we've seen the police force kind of by its massive overreaction reinvigorate the movement.
No, because they don't. The police isn't accustomed to people protesting.
That's not true because we saw there's been
pros at that.
There's been yeah, and what we've seen this since 2004, and even before that with Giuliani. But in 2004 with the Republican National Convention, you had a huge overreaction, a lot of arrests of journalists. We see this again and again.
I think what you're really seeing is the whole Occupy movement at an interesting tipping point. You've seen mayors who were sympathetic and largely aligned with the goals of the movement, from Mayor Sam Adams in Portland to Oakland's mayor, come to the realization that these actual counterculture collective expressions, that moving from assembly to occupy, was creating a fundamental problem when it came to the rights of other citizens in the communities. And you're seeing poll numbers for Occupy go down. So I think this is a really interesting challenge. Whether they can channel this energy into a constructive, positive agenda, or whether they'll end up being a destructive force that alienates more people than they attract.
Michelle, were there a lot of people there yesterday? Because I actually went down there a few weeks ago, and it looked like, just like a homeless shelter. Like there weren't very many people
and that's what
there.
it was becoming. And then, like I said, the police have totally reinvigorated it. So first there was thousands of people downtown, and then there was their biggest ever march yesterday, more than 10,000 people over the Brooklyn Bridge.
Well, I was grateful that they decided to use the pedestrian walkway, not block traffic, because that would have been a real dumb decision on like 8 different levels. Let's talk final word. Ramin, final word.
It's Regis.
Resilience.
Super committee. That's all for us right now at NewsBeast. We will see you on Monday. Take care.